The roads narrowed as Sam drove deeper into the forest, the pavement slowly crumbling into gravel under the tires. Dense trees loomed over them on both sides, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. The sunlight, once so bright, was now filtered through the dense foliage, casting long, eerie shadows across the windshield. Ellie shifted uneasily in the passenger seat, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting a lock of her dark hair. "This place is really out there, isn't it?" Ellie said, her voice breaking the tense silence that had settled between them during the long drive. Sam grinned, though his eyes remained focused on the winding road. "That's the point, right? Complete disconnection. No emails, no work calls, no stress. Just us and nature." He glanced at her, his smile softening. "You've been so stressed lately. This could be good for us." Ellie forced a smile, though the growing knot in her stomach told her otherwise. She had never been fond of remote places, especially ones as secluded as this. But Sam had been so excited about Tom's invitation. She couldn't bring herself to dampen his enthusiasm, even if something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her. Tom, an old friend from Sam's college days, had reached out unexpectedly a few weeks ago. They hadn't spoken to him in years. Life had a way of driving wedges between people after all. But out of nowhere, he'd sent Sam a message. "Hey, if you're ever looking for a break from city life, I've got the perfect place. Cabin in the woods, totally isolated, surrounded by nature. Just what the doctor ordered." The offer had seemed so casual, so perfect. Tom had always been the adventurous type, and Sam had jumped at the idea of a weekend away, practically begging Ellie to say yes. After some hesitation, she had relented, thinking maybe the change of scenery would help them reset after the rough patch they'd been going through. But now, as they ventured deeper into the forest, Ellie felt an overwhelming sense of dread creeping over her. The trees seemed closer, the forest thicker, as if it were slowly closing in on them. She tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on her anxiety, but the unease gnawed at her. Finally, they reached a clearing. The gravel road widened and opened up to reveal the cabin, a small, weathered structure nestled deep in the woods. It was old, the wood grayed with time, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dark, reflecting the twisted branches of the surrounding trees. Ellie stared at it, her unease deepening. "I thought you said it would be cozy," she murmured. Sam parked the car and shut off the engine, looking at the cabin with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. "It's rustic," he said with a chuckle. "Don't worry, it'll grow on you. And once Tom gets here, I'm sure everything will feel better." They stepped out of the car and the air around them felt thick and heavy, as though the forest itself was watching them. Ellie rubbed her arms, suddenly aware of the cold despite the warm summer day. There was no sign of Tom, no other car, no lights on in the cabin, no sound but the distant rustle of leaves. "Maybe he went into town for supplies," Sam suggested, sensing her discomfort. "Maybe," Ellie replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She scanned the tree line, her eyes playing tricks on her. Shadows seemed to move among the trees, but every time she tried to focus on them, they disappeared. They grabbed their bags and headed for the cabin. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they approached the door. The porch sagged slightly, and the paint on the door was peeling, revealing layers of old, faded colors beneath. Sam fumbled with the keys Tom had sent them, and the lock clicked open with a rusty groan. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the fading daylight filtering through the dust-covered windows. The air was musty, thick with the scent of aged wood, and something else, something Ellie couldn't quite place but found unsettling. The furniture was old, mismatched, and covered in a thin layer of dust. A few cobwebs hung in the corners, and the silence inside was oppressive, almost suffocating. "It's quaint," Sam said, setting their bags down and rubbing his hands together. "I'll get a fire going. That'll brighten things up a bit." Ellie nodded, though her unease had only grown since stepping inside. She wandered over to the window and looked out, expecting to see the car or maybe a trail leading back to the road. But the forest stretched out before her, dark and impenetrable. The road they'd driven in on was no longer visible, just trees, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Sam busied himself with the fireplace, trying to kindle a flame, while Ellie explored the cabin, her steps cautious. The place felt wrong, like it was waiting for something, or someone. She paused by one of the windows and froze. A soft tapping sound echoed through the room, coming from the glass. It was faint, like someone drumming their fingers against the pane. Ellie's heart quickened. She stared at the window, her breath caught in her throat. There was nothing there, only darkness, thick and endless. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, peering into the night, but she saw nothing except the dense shadows of the trees. "Sam," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" Sam replied, turning from the fireplace, the flicker of flame dancing in his eyes. Ellie listened again, but the sound had stopped. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Never mind. It's probably just the wind." Sam chuckled. "Relax, Elle. You're letting this place get to you. Let's settle in and wait for Tom. He'll be here soon, and then we can all laugh about how creepy the cabin seemed at first." Ellie nodded slowly, though the tension in her chest refused to ease. As the fire finally took hold and the room warmed, Sam poured them both glasses of wine, trying to lighten the mood. They sat together on the old couch, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. But outside, in the depths of the forest, something was watching. Ellie could feel it. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that the cabin wasn't just a place. It was something more, something ancient, something alive, and it was waiting for them. The next morning, Ellie awoke to the sound of silence. For a moment, she lay still in bed, the weight of the quiet pressing down on her. Sam was already up, his side of the bed cold. She sat up slowly, blinking at the dim light filtering through the window. Outside, the fog hung thick and heavy over the forest, shrouding everything in a dense, ghostly veil. She could hear Sam moving around in the kitchen, the occasional clatter of dishes breaking the oppressive quiet. Pulling on a sweater, Ellie made her way to the main room. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow across the worn wooden floor. Sam stood by the window, peering outside. "Any sign of Tom?" Ellie asked, her voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might disturb the delicate stillness of the cabin. Sam shook his head, not turning away from the window. "Nothing. I tried calling him earlier, but there's still no reception. Maybe he got held up in town." Ellie frowned, stepping closer to him. The fog outside was so thick she could barely see the trees a few yards from the cabin. It was unnatural, this kind of fog, not the kind that rolls in during the early morning and lifts with the sun. This fog clung to the air, heavy and suffocating, as if it had settled over them like a shroud. "I don't like this," Ellie whispered. "What if something happened to him?" Sam finally turned to face her, his expression more annoyed than concerned. "Elle, we can't start thinking like that. It's just the woods. He probably got delayed or lost signal, and he'll be here soon. We need to just relax and enjoy this place, all right?" Ellie didn't reply. She knew Sam was trying to keep things light, trying to keep her calm, but it wasn't working. There was something wrong here. She felt it in the air, in the way the cabin seemed to settle around them like a living thing. She tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to her like the fog outside. As the day dragged on, they tried to distract themselves, Sam with a book, and Ellie with a crossword puzzle they had found tucked away in a drawer. But the oppressive atmosphere in the cabin made it hard to focus. Ellie couldn't stop glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something out there in the fog. Her mind kept drifting back to the soft tapping she'd heard the night before, the way the shadows seemed to move just out of sight. By mid-afternoon, the whispers began. They started faintly at first, so soft that Ellie thought it was the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as the hours passed, the voices grew louder. They were just on the edge of hearing, distant and indistinct, as though carried by the breeze from deep within the forest. "Sam," Ellie said quietly, looking up from her crossword, "do you hear that?" Sam looked up from his book, frowning. "Hear what?" Ellie strained her ears. The whispers were there, faint but persistent, a murmur just beyond the walls of the cabin. She couldn't make out the words, but there was something insidious about them, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "It's like whispers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper itself. "Like someone's talking, but I can't understand them." Sam put down his book and stood, listening. For a long moment there was nothing but the crackling of the dying fire and the creak of the old cabin settling around them. But then Sam's expression shifted, his brow furrowed, his gaze distant. "I hear it now," he said, his voice low. Ellie's heart began to race. She wasn't imagining it. Sam heard it too. The whispers grew louder for a moment, then faded again, like the wind had carried them away. She moved closer to Sam, her anxiety rising with every passing second. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think it's Tom?" "I don't know," Sam said, his eyes locked on the door as if expecting someone, or something, to walk through it at any moment. "It's probably just the wind or animals. This place is messing with our heads." But Ellie wasn't so sure. There was something wrong with those whispers, something unnatural. They sounded too deliberate, too purposeful to be the wind. It was as though someone, or something, was out there, just beyond their reach, watching them, waiting for them. As the day faded into evening, the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow bolder, creeping closer, becoming more distinct. Sometimes Ellie thought she heard her name carried on the wind, soft but unmistakable. Each time she heard it, a chill ran down her spine. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The cabin felt wrong, too still, too quiet, except for the occasional whisper that drifted through the cracks in the walls. Sam had managed to fall asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even, but Ellie lay awake, staring into the darkness. That's when she heard it again, the tapping. It was so faint at first that she thought she might be imagining it, but it persisted, growing louder until it was unmistakable, fingers drumming against the window pane. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was cold, colder than it had been earlier, and her breath formed small clouds in the air. "Sam," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Sam, wake up." Sam groaned and rolled over, but didn't wake. Ellie glanced at the window, dread building in her stomach. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Slowly, she slid out of bed and crept toward the window, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. She reached the window and hesitated, her fingers hovering over the curtain. Taking a deep breath, she pulled it back and looked outside. There was nothing there, only darkness. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere else now, closer. She spun around, scanning the room. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes landed on the corner of the room where the shadows were deeper, darker than they should have been. Something was there just beyond the edge of the firelight. She could feel it watching her. Suddenly, the bed shook violently, jolting Sam awake with a gasp. He sat up, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. What the hell? Ellie stumbled back from the window, her pulse racing. Did you feel that? Something's here. Sam leapt out of bed, his face pale. It's the wind, he said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the living room where the fire had nearly gone out, leaving the cabin cloaked in shadow. The whispers were louder now, filling the room, swirling around them like a dark presence. Ellie could hear them clearly, but they still made no sense, just incoherent murmurs that seemed to be taunting them. "Sam, we need to leave," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." Sam was already heading toward the door, but when he opened it, the fog outside was so thick that it looked like a solid wall of white. There was no way they could navigate through it. The road, the car, everything was swallowed by the mist. "We can't," Sam said, his voice low. "We're trapped." Ellie's heart sank. She had never felt fear like this before, pure, unrelenting terror that gnawed at her insides. The whispers, the tapping, the shaking bed. It was all too much. She could feel the cabin closing in on them, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing darker. And somewhere in the depths of the fog, something was waiting. They were no longer alone in the cabin. Something had found them, something that had been waiting for them all along, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The fog had not lifted by the time morning arrived. It clung to the cabin like a suffocating veil, so thick that Ellie couldn't even see the trees surrounding them. The oppressive silence from the day before had returned, but this time it felt more sinister, as though something within the fog was deliberately masking all sound. No birds sang, no leaves rustled. The world outside was as dead as the creeping dread inside Ellie's chest. Sam sat at the small wooden table, hunched over a bowl of cereal he wasn't eating. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. Neither of them had slept much the night before, haunted by the whispers, the tapping, the sense that something was lurking just beyond the threshold of the cabin. Ellie paced restlessly around the small room, her mind whirling. Tom should have been here by now. This isn't right. It's been too long, Sam. Where is he? Sam stared blankly at his cereal, as if willing the soggy flakes to offer him an answer. After a long pause, he looked up at Ellie, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we need to figure something out. We can't just stay here and wait." Ellie stopped pacing, her heart racing as she fought to control the rising panic. "We need to leave, find the road, and drive until we have a signal again. I don't care how thick that fog is, we have to try." Sam nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "Let's just check around the cabin first. Maybe there's something we're missing, something that could help." Ellie swallowed her frustration, biting back the urge to argue. She didn't want to stay in this place a moment longer, but Sam was right. They had no idea what they were up against. They needed to gather whatever information they could. She nodded, and together they began searching the cabin more thoroughly than before. As Ellie rummaged through the drawers of an old dresser, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled out a set of keys, old and rusted, attached to a key ring shaped like a small wooden cabin. Ellie stared at it, a chill running down her spine. How long had these keys been here? And what did they open? "Sam, look at this," Ellie called, holding up the keys. Sam glanced over but quickly returned to his own search. "We'll figure it out. Just keep looking. There has to be something in here that explains what's going on." Ellie pocketed the keys and moved to another corner of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. That's when she noticed it, a small loose floorboard beneath the old rug. It was slightly raised, just enough to catch her eye. Kneeling down, Ellie tugged at the edge of the floorboard until it came free with a soft groan of protest. Beneath the floor was a small compartment, and inside it lay something Ellie hadn't expected. An old leather-bound journal, its cover worn and faded with age. The pages were yellowed, and the edges curled slightly from years of neglect. She picked it up carefully, her hands trembling. "Sam, I found something." Sam abandoned his search and joined her, his expression one of guarded hope. Ellie opened the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the brittle pages. The handwriting inside was cramped and rushed, the ink faded but still legible. The names scrawled across the first page made Ellie's heart skip a beat. Thomas R. Hayward. Ellie stared at the name, her breath catching in her throat. "It's Tom's. This is Tom's journal." Sam took the journal from her hands, his face paling as he flipped through the pages. The first few entries were normal, mundane thoughts about the isolation, the beauty of the woods, how much he enjoyed the peace and quiet. But as the entries continued, they became darker, more frantic. Tom began writing about strange noises, about feeling like he was being watched. His handwriting grew shakier with each entry, his words more desperate. Sam read aloud one of the later entries, his voice tight with tension. June 15th. "I don't know what's out there. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. There's something in the woods, something that's been watching me for days. I hear it every night, whispers tapping on the windows. I've seen things, shadows, moving in ways they shouldn't. I don't know what to believe anymore." Ellie's stomach turned, the whispers, the tapping. It was all the same. Whatever had haunted Tom was now haunting them. Sam continued reading, his voice trembling slightly as he turned to the next page. June 18th. "I found it. Deep in the woods there's an altar. It's old, covered in moss and strange carvings I can't understand. I don't know who built it or why, but the moment I saw it, I felt something dark. Ever since then, things have gotten worse. I think the cabin, it's connected to the altar somehow. I can't leave. I've tried, but every time I head for the road, the fog closes in, and I end up back here. It's like the forest itself is alive, like it's keeping me here." Ellie felt sick. She could hear Tom's panic in his words, could feel the suffocating terror that had gripped him in his final days. "He was trapped," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just like us." Sam closed the journal and stared at Ellie, his expression unreadable. He knew something was out there, and he found something in the woods. Ellie nodded slowly. "The altar. He said the cabin was connected to it somehow. Maybe that's what's keeping us here, too." Sam stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Then we need to find it. If that altar is connected to all of this, maybe destroying it will break whatever's holding us here." Ellie hesitated, the thought of venturing deeper into the woods filling her with dread. The fog still swirled outside, thick and unyielding, but they had no other options. They couldn't just sit in the cabin and wait for whatever was out there to come for them. "Okay," Ellie agreed reluctantly, "but we need to be careful. If Tom couldn't find a way out, we have to assume that whatever's out there is dangerous." Sam nodded, though his face was set with determination. "We'll be careful, but we need to act fast. The longer we stay here, the worse things will get." They packed quickly, taking only what they thought they might need. Flashlights, water, and the rusted set of keys Ellie had found earlier. She wasn't sure what the keys unlocked, but something told her they might be important. Before they left, Ellie glanced at the journal one last time, her eyes lingering on the final entry. The words were barely legible, scrawled in a frantic hand as though Tom had been writing them in a panic. "June 21st. It's too late for me. Whatever it is, it's already inside. I can hear it now, whispering to me, calling my name. I tried to resist, but I can't anymore. I'm losing myself. If anyone finds this, if anyone reads this, leave. Destroy the altar. Don't let it take you too." Ellie shuddered and closed the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever had happened to Tom, whatever had taken him, was still out there, and now it was after them. As they stepped out into the dense fog, the air felt colder than before, heavier. The world around them was silent, save for the distant echo of whispers that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Ellie gripped Sam's hand tightly, her pulse quickening as they began their journey into the woods toward whatever horrors lay waiting in the shadows. The cabin loomed behind them, a dark silhouette in the mist, its windows like empty eyes watching them go. For a brief moment, Ellie swore she saw a figure standing in one of the windows, staring out at them, its face obscured by shadow. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Shaking off the unease that clung to her, Ellie forced herself to focus on the path ahead. They had to find the altar. They had to destroy it. It was their only chance of escaping this nightmare, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The fog clung to the trees like a living thing, tendrils of white mist curling through the branches and wrapping around Ellie and Sam as they ventured deeper into the woods. Every step they took was met with resistance, as if the forest itself were trying to hold them back, dragging at their legs with invisible hands. The trees seemed to close in on them, the undergrowth growing denser, the air colder and more oppressive. The whispers had returned, though now they were louder, closer. They came from every direction, filling the air with their insidious murmurs. Ellie's grip tightened on the flashlight, the beam trembling as her hands shook. She glanced over at Sam, who trudged ahead of her with grim determination, the journal tucked under one arm. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left the cabin, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted nervously between the shadows. "Do you think we're close?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded, though he didn't turn to look at her. "We have to be. The journal said the altar was deep in the woods. If we just keep moving." A sound cut through the fog, a low, guttural groan, like something ancient stirring beneath the earth. They both froze, their hearts pounding in unison. The sound echoed through the trees, growing louder and more distinct, and then it faded into the distance, leaving only the soft rustle of the fog-draped forest. Ellie swallowed hard, trying to shake the fear that clutched at her chest. What was that? "I don't know," Sam said quietly, his voice strained. "But we can't stop now. We have to keep going." Ellie nodded, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back. But there was no turning back anymore. They were too far in, too deep into whatever nightmare had claimed the cabin and the woods around it. And she knew deep down that if they stopped now, they would never leave. They continued walking, the fog growing thicker with every step, the forest around them darkening as though the sun itself had abandoned them. The whispers followed them, louder now, and Ellie could almost make out words, taunting, mocking voices that seemed to echo from every corner of the woods. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. She had never felt so afraid, not even in the cabin. This was different. This was pure, primal terror. It was as if the forest were alive, watching them, hunting them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, through the mist, they saw it. The altar. It stood in the center of a small clearing, a crude stone structure overgrown with moss and vines, ancient symbols etched into its surface. The air around it felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the altar itself radiated a dark energy. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that made Ellie's head spin, and she had to resist the urge to cover her ears. Sam approached the altar cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. Ellie followed, her skin prickling with dread. There was something wrong about the altar, something profoundly unnatural. It didn't belong here in this world. It felt as though it had been pulled from some ancient, forgotten realm and placed in the heart of the forest to fester and grow, feeding on the fear and despair of anyone who ventured too close. As Sam knelt before the altar, he set the journal on the ground and began flipping through the pages, his fingers moving quickly over the faded words. "This is it," he muttered, more to himself than to Ellie. "This is what Tom found. This is what's keeping us here." Ellie's gaze drifted to the carvings on the altar, twisting, spiraling symbols that seemed to shift and writhe beneath her eyes. She felt dizzy, as if the very ground beneath her feet was unsteady, and she had to steady herself against a nearby tree. The air around the altar was cold, almost unbearably so, and the whispers had grown deafening, their words no longer incoherent. She could hear them now. "Leave. Stay. You cannot escape." They were speaking directly to her, as if the forest, the fog, the altar itself had become sentient, aware of their presence. It knew them. It had been watching them all along, feeding off their fear, their confusion. "Sam, we need to destroy it," Ellie said, her voice trembling with urgency. "We need to end this now." Sam didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the altar, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like a mixture of fear and fascination. "There's something wrong with this place," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I can feel it. It's alive." Ellie moved closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sam, we have to destroy it. Now." But Sam didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the altar, his eyes glazed over as though he had fallen into some kind of trance. Ellie reached out to shake him, her fingers digging into his arm. "Sam, please." Finally, Sam snapped out of it, shaking his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. He looked at Ellie, his expression one of grim determination. "You're right, we have to destroy it." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small metal crowbar they had brought with them for protection. Without hesitation, Sam raised the crowbar and brought it down on the altar with a heavy thud. The stone cracked, a jagged fissure splitting the surface. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices screaming in protest, but Sam didn't stop. He struck the altar again and again, each blow sending shards of stone flying into the fog. Ellie watched in tense silence, her heart in her throat. Every blow Sam delivered seemed to take a toll on the forest around them. The trees groaned, the ground trembled, and the fog seemed to writhe and twist like a living thing in pain. Finally, with one last swing, the altar shattered completely. The stone crumbled into pieces, the ancient carvings broken and scattered across the ground. The moment the altar fell, the whispers stopped. The fog began to lift, slowly at first, then faster, peeling away from the forest like a curtain being drawn back. Ellie let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. It was over. Whatever dark power had held them in its grasp was gone. But as the fog cleared and the light began to return to the woods, Ellie noticed something strange. The cabin, the one they had left behind far in the distance, was visible through the thinning mist. Though they had walked what felt like miles into the forest, it shouldn't have been there. They should have been much farther away. "Sam," Ellie said, her voice trembling with confusion. "Look." Sam turned, following her gaze. His face paled as he saw it, too, the cabin standing exactly where it had been all along, as though they had never left. "That's not possible," Sam whispered, taking a step back. We walked so far. How?" But the truth was undeniable. The forest had never let them go. The altar was destroyed, but they were still trapped. Ellie's heart sank as the reality of their situation set in. The fog may have lifted, and the whispers may have stopped, but they were still caught in the same terrible nightmare. The cabin loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes staring back at them. "We didn't escape," Ellie whispered, her voice hollow. "It was never about the altar. It was always the cabin. The cabin is the key." Sam's face twisted with despair. "Then how do we stop it? How do we get out?" Ellie shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't have an answer. The cabin had drawn them in, just as it had drawn Tom and countless others before them. It had twisted their minds, toyed with their fears, and now it refused to let them go. As they stood in the clearing, the reality of their fate sinking in, Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers had returned, not as loud as before, but present, faint, taunting. "Stay." She turned to Sam, her voice shaking. "We can't let it win. We have to keep fighting. We have to try to find a way out." Sam nodded, though the look in his eyes was one of defeat. Together they began the long walk back toward the cabin, their steps heavy with the weight of what they now understood. The truth of the cabin was more horrifying than they could have imagined. It wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, an ancient force that fed on the souls of those who wandered too far into the woods, and it had them now. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the whispers grew louder again, wrapping around them like a cold embrace. The fog began to close in once more, and Ellie felt the crushing weight of the cabin's gaze on her back. They weren't escaping. they never would.